We are back talking about Chapter 8 here. I think we left off in the video for the first part of the chapter. I think we left off here talking about marginal revenue product is essentially the demand for labor. We talked about one reason that it slopes down is because as wages are lower, employers are willing to hire more people, right? So at this lower wage, if we go over to the demand line, workers are willing to hire more workers. This is units of labor on the horizontal axis here. Also, we have diminishing returns, right? So the marginal product, the additional product or output for adding additional units of labor, that marginal product falls as we add more and more labor. So it's still adding product, but diminishing returns suggests that as we add more and more labor, we're getting more output, but that additional output, the amount of that output is shrinking somewhat. And because the product is going down as we add more and more units of labor, the marginal revenue product also goes down as well. We talked about in sports, so we might have a limited number of games. For instance, the NBA, 82 games. So we don't have more games necessarily, not more output in terms of number of games, but the revenue might change. So TV rights has gone up quite a bit, as we mentioned at the end of the last video lecture, and that shifts the marginal revenue product line out because the revenue associated with each game, each unit of product, has increased, shifting that marginal revenue product out to the right, and hence the demand for labor. Because we have restricted roster sizes, impacts player wages. The rosters don't necessarily grow, but the players who are on the roster see higher wages because the marginal revenue product has increased. All right, so Derrick Rose, right? So it's several years old now, but he did win the MVP right before your textbook was published, so it uses him as an example. There's only one Derrick Rose, so the supply line is vertical here. This is the only possible supply of Derrick Rose on our labor continuum. Intuitively, this makes sense, right? The demand, however many teams are willing to bid on Derrick Rose's services, is what's going to determine the wage. So what determines the demand for Derrick Rose? Well, his marginal revenue product. So what product does he produce, and what revenue is associated with that particular product? So first we got to know, what do players produce, right? We hope, as fans, coaches, general managers, they're hoping that players are going to produce wins, right? There's a certain amount of revenue that's going to be associated with each additional win, right? The book is using this equation to represent this. A marginal revenue product of a player is equal to the marginal revenue associated with each team win times the change in wins associated with that particular player. Here's our MRP subscript IJ. That's the marginal revenue product of player I on team J. Marginal revenue again per win, and then the change in wins that a particular team J gets from player I, right? Now we also know, not represented in this equation, is that with Derrick Rose on the team, maybe the marginal revenue associated with losses goes up too, right? Meaning that whether the team wins or loses, there's more demand for, say, New York Knicks games because Derrick Rose is on the team. So we're going to stick with this formula that your textbook uses in terms of marginal revenue product having to do with changes in wins, but do realize that, especially for superstars, they can influence the revenue just associated with games in general, whether it's wins or losses. So we need to know, okay, if we're hoping that players produce wins, how does Derrick Rose produce wins? And more specifically, how do we come up with this part of the equation, right? The change in wins associated with Derrick Rose. Well, there's an economist. He's at the University of Southern Utah named David Berry. He writes his own blog that is kind of like the sabermetrics of the NBA, or the Moneyball of the NBA, if you will. It's called The Wages of Wins. You can check it out at wagesofwins.com. He has an analysis model that he uses to answer this question, trying to relate players' performance to team wins. He uses regression. Wins, in this case, is the dependent variable in the regression. Players' stats are the independent variables. What he does is he takes players' stats for the entire league, puts them into this equation as the independent variable, puts wins as the dependent variable, and he gets certain coefficients, right, that are associated with each variable, essentially telling us how important is each one of these statistics, how important are these statistics to changes in wins, right? Once he comes up with the coefficients on this regression equation, then he can drop individual player stats into the formula, the regression formula, and get an output of what's the change in wins that particular player is responsible for. So think back to our salary regression equation that we used before. Same idea, right? You've got a certain coefficient that's associated with player stats. Only the dependent variable in that regression was salary. How much should we pay the player? Here it's wins, right? This is a very simplified version of his equation. You can go to wagesofwins.com. You see the link there on your screen, and you can see in more detail how he comes up with this. Let's look at what this results in. So here I've taken a snapshot of his list from 2011. See, Derrick Rose comes in at 21st on his list, his analysis, producing, this is the change in wins variable, producing essentially 10 wins in 2011. David and some other economists have approximated the marginal revenue per win. Of course, this number is going to be team dependent. Wins are perhaps worth more in a bigger market than a smaller market, the revenue associated with each win. Also, it's dependent on how many wins your team already has, right? Additional wins, once you have a lot of wins, are not worth as much as wins when you're right in the playoff hunt, let's say, or you're fighting for a first round bye. The revenue associated with those particular wins, which is usually in the 50 to 60 wins in the NBA, are worth more than $1.67 million. But as an average, we'll say that the marginal revenue per win is about $1.67 million. So we know this is our calculated marginal product of Derrick Rose, 10.17 wins. We take this times marginal revenue per win, and it gives us about 17 million, which is Derrick Rose's marginal revenue product. And in 2012, Derrick Rose signs an actual contract with a 1-year base of 16.4 million. Very close to what we calculated as his marginal revenue product. Probably no coincidence that that's the case. His agent, if he has a good agent, which I'm sure he probably does, his agent is aware of this research. He's using it in negotiation. At the same time, the team is probably using this in negotiation as well, saying, hey, Derrick Rose, yeah, he won the MVP, but he's 21st on the list of number of wins he's responsible for. And so I'm looking at, if I'm the team, I'm looking at the salaries of some of these players above them. We have a truncated list here, but there's 19 more players above them. And I'm saying, well, I don't want to pay Derrick Rose that much more than some of these players that are above him, right? It's all part of this negotiating process. Let's talk about LeBron, somebody a little bit more relevant right now. So LeBron wins the MVP the following season. It was a shortened season because of the collective bargaining agreement disagreements that were going on in the lockout. So it was a 62-game season. According to David Berry's calculation, LeBron's worth about 17 wins, which was the most in the NBA. If we take that number times the 1.67, the marginal revenue per win, we get for LeBron almost $29 million. He was paid by the Heat in that season $17.5 million. So not as much as his marginal revenue product would suggest that he was worth. Couple reasons for that. The NBA's collective bargaining, of course, has a max player provision in it as well. We know that LeBron took a little bit less money to play with some other superstars on his team. So that's also reflected in that salary there. And Berry finds, similar to the Moneyball situation that we'll talk about later in the semester with baseball, Berry and his calculations find that teams reward points more than they do win production. They overvalue points, I think David would say. Just like baseball teams were overvaluing home runs, right? They were paying more than they should have for home runs. The A's figured that out. They were paying more than they should have for batting average. The A's figured that out and said, you know what, we're going to pay for on-base percentage. We're not going to pay for batting average. We're not going to pay for home runs because on-base percentage is more correlated with run production in their model. In this chapter, we're also reminded of this idea of a monopoly situation, right? So although we're talking about the labor market, the product market, we know from the previous chapter, is somewhat restricted. Maybe not a perfect monopoly, but a pseudo-monopoly in that it's not perfect competition in the product market, meaning the production of games and the number of teams is not what a competitive market would bear. It's artificially restricted by the size of the league, what the owners vote on in terms of number of teams and roster sizes and number of games, right? The owners are deciding all of this somewhat collectively with the players and collective bargaining, but it's pretty much the owners deciding. So they're not producing as many games as the market will bear. They're deciding how many games there's going to be and how many teams there's going to be, right? There's 30 NBA teams. Maybe there's 35, 36 markets that could support an NBA team. We don't know. The important thing and the reason that the authors are bringing this up in this chapter is that monopolists, because their marginal revenue is a little bit below the actual margin, what the marginal revenue would be in a fully competitive market, we know that a monopolist is going to restrict output, which means hiring fewer workers, paying slightly or somewhat lower wages than might be paid in a competitive market. Just think about if there was 35 or 36 NBA teams, or as many as the different metro markets could bear in the U.S. and Canada, that's more teams bidding for talent, right? That's more teams with professional players, right? The labor market's expanded all the way to the actual supply and demand instead of the restricted supply and demand that we have in this situation. So we know that equilibrium would normally, or would be, where supply and demand would meet in terms of wages and labor. We do have restricted roster sizes, so in actuality, right, there's a restriction here in terms of whatever the roster sizes are and the number of teams. If you took the rivalry class with me, you know that Bird and Magic kind of saved the NBA in the early to mid 90s. The NBA was in big trouble in the 70s, very much sinking popularity, became much more popular in the 80s. The number of games didn't expand, but with the greater demand for the NBA product, they didn't produce more product in terms of number of games, but they expanded then in the mid and late 80s, right? Addition of the Orlando Magic, addition of the Minnesota Timberwolves, and then the addition of the Miami Heat, addition of Charlotte Hornets. Actually, I think the Hornets came in with the the Orlando Magic, and the Heat came in with the Timberwolves, if I remember correctly, in late 80s, early 90s, I think. So they recognized the demand for more product. They produced more product by expanding the number of teams. But also, demand shifted to the right because the revenue associated with each product, each game, increased quite a bit, right? That was even more drastic than the increase in the product itself, the addition of a few new teams and slightly increasing roster sizes. That shift out, so the labor restrictions shifted out a little bit with the addition of new teams, bigger roster size. Whoops, that's not a very good L there. Addition of new roster sizes shifted out a little bit, but there was still a gap here, right? It's still less than what equilibrium would demand, and so salaries rose, right? Wages go up. We see with that shift right in demand that the equilibrium point goes up. Again, this is wages on the vertical axis. Demand is here, right? This is our wage point. We see that's gone up from where it was at labor zero. Here we see that graph from the book. Same idea. In an unregulated market, meaning no artificial restrictions, roster sizes would go up. In good times, it would go down. In bad times, as that demand curve shifted in either direction, out, as we saw on the last slide, or the NBA does poorly. The NBA went through a stretch after Bird and Magic basically retired. Jordan carried the league for several years, and then Jordan retires, right? The NBA went through a real lull period kind of before, well, it was somewhat during Kobe's time, but then LeBron and Kobe together, Shaq, helped sort of bring the league back toward the end of Shaq's career, I guess. More the LeBron effect. Kevin Durant, obviously Curry now has helped continue that popularity. As we talked about, the rosters are limited, artificially limited. Now, from a labor standpoint, is this good for labor or bad for labor, right? Well, we would evaluate this by looking and seeing, okay, what's the area of this, because this is the wages getting paid to the players that exist, right? This is the roster limit. We see that wages are a little bit higher than if there was no artificial limit. Here's the equilibrium point. As long as let me get another color here. As long as the area of this red rectangle is greater than the area of this blue square, you guys love my drawings, don't you? Then it's good for labor. It's less people, but the people that are there are making more money, right? As long as that outweighs this, then it's a net positive for labor. If this blue square is bigger, meaning rosters are overly restricted, even though the people are getting paid more, it's really a net negative for labor in general. So let's talk about human capital for a little bit. All of you are familiar with this. You're invested in this education. You're invested in this class. You're trying to build your human capital. You're trying to build your skills that will transfer to increase productivity in the future in your career, right? You're making an investment in training to increase those skills. Well, there's two types of investments. One is general skills. You're trying to build general skills. Another is skills specific to only one firm, right? The kind of rule of thumb is if you're investing or you're engaged in general skill training, the employee pays for it, right? because you can take that training and apply it at different companies, right? So companies are going to be hesitant to pay for you to get general training because you can just take that training and go to a different firm, right? And then the company's out their investment, which is why we don't see a lot of companies that pay for undergraduate education. Undergraduate education is thought of as being more general skills that you can apply in a lot of different areas. We do see companies sometimes pay for graduate education, more specialized, right? Not necessarily to a single firm, but more specialized to an industry. Excuse me. Pause this for a minute. All right. And I was saying companies will pay for specific skills up to a certain degree. And usually there's some kind of clause with it, right? Like you have to stay with our firm after you get that graduate education for a certain number of years, you have to reimburse us. So there's a reason why some of you might recognize this particular player, obviously a Bengals draft pick, maybe, I don't know. Several years ago, one of the Bengals' top picks, Akili Smith, ring a bell for anybody? So Akili Smith went to Oregon. Oregon has long, even before Chip Kelly made it famous, Oregon has long been an innovator of the spread offense, and Akili racked up huge numbers in college. But as those of you that are football fans realize, the pro game is quite a bit different than the college game, and the translation of sort of that type of offense was more of a specific skill, didn't translate well to the NFL. Right, the Bengals suffered for that. Unfortunately, they also fell victim to that with David Klingler, who was at Texas Tech. Again, wide open spread offense, put up big numbers in college, but gets to the pros and it doesn't translate, right? So he wasn't learning like the general skills in a college football environment that would translate well sort of to the NFL. Rank order tournaments, this is the last part sort of this chapter. Again, in economics, we're thinking about incentives a lot, especially in labor economics, which is what we're talking about now. So if we're working for, say, the Western and Southern Open, and up in Mason, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, we got to set up our prize structure. Of course, we're working together with the ATP and the WTA in order to do that. But we want to reward productivity, right? Typically in tournaments, rank order is used, which is a measure of relative productivity, right? My productivity versus the other people in the tournament, right? Who's ahead of who in these slots? Why do we do rank order? Well, in an ideal world, the best incentive would be to reward any workers, but players, in the case of tournaments, for their marginal revenue product, right? Whatever they produce, what's the revenue associated with that production, right? But it's pretty hard to measure that in a tournament environment. So usually you're paying them by how far they advance in the particular tournament or what order they finish in the tournament. And then some associated revenue with that product. With how far they advance. But these rewards are not linear, right? They're discontinuous, so you see the word non-linear there. Meaning that it's not typically adding $50,000 as you move up throughout the whole, let's say it's a tournament with 64 players, right? You're not adding $50,000 each spot, right? That would be a linear payout. Usually instead, what you get is a very high incentive for the top players, and then that drops pretty rapidly for the medium and lower players. Why do you think that is? Well, you see it already there. Here's a hint for you. Well, you're trying to create an incentive, right, for them to really try and win the tournament, to try and be the best, to exert that extra effort to win the tournament. That makes for the best entertainment, theoretically. And so That's the kind of reward structure that you want. Here you see it on a graph, right? In this case, we're looking at the justification for that type of reward structure, that the quantity of effort, the effort out here, has a lot higher marginal cost associated with it, if we follow that up. This, given 100%, or sometimes we hear 110%. I've always wondered how that was possible. Isn't 100% the maximum effort? Anyway, I'm sure you've all heard that phrase, 110%, right? Well, the marginal cost of that 110% is a lot higher than the marginal cost from giving 80% and going to 90%, right? It's exerting a lot more. Those of you that have been competitive athletes, whether it's in high school, junior high, whatever situation, some of you maybe as college athletes, you know that it's that extra pull it out from inside of you, right? That has kind of the biggest marginal cost. It's hard to get it out of you, right? So you want your reward structure to reflect or to incentivize the athletes that are able to do that, right? This would be a linear, this line would be a linear reward structure. If we had that reward structure, we'd only get this level of output, right? Where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost, right? But if we have a nonlinear one that's exponentially increasing, then we're going to get instead a better quantity of effort. We're going to get that extra marginal cost out of that individual. What if one player is the likely winner, right? That's the downside. If you have an incentive structure like that, the effort by the others might fall. Like if you put all of the incentive on that top position. Another downside is, okay, all the money's at the top. I might sabotage others' performance. I might cheat in order to win, to get to the top, right? This comes out particularly in motorsports. And we see this graph here that shows that because of that effect in motorsports and the danger involved with racing cars, you don't want people to go above and beyond and take extraordinary risks to get to that top position. So you see a much flatter incentive structure in NASCAR than you do in the PGA. Here, let me get a different color here. In the PGA, right, that's this darker line here. You get a relatively flat incentive structure, and then once you get to the top 10, it skyrockets, right? You're trying to pull out that marginal cost of extra effort, right, and reward it. This would be NASCAR, right? It compresses the wages, keeps it relatively flat to avoid that sabotage or cheating. Superstar economics, very similar to what we just described. It's just that superstars are worth more, right? They have a much greater marginal revenue product because there's a lot more revenue associated. The key is this term, the revenue associated with their product versus the product of a role player, right? There's not as much revenue associated with it. You're not tuning in to watch Cavs games to watch the role players necessarily, right? You're tuning in to watch the superstar. Whether you like LeBron or you're rooting against LeBron, you're still tuning in. He's generating ratings, right? That superstar is generating ratings, and that's increasing his marginal revenue product, and therefore the demand for him as a superstar. TV, as I described, is skewing this demand for superstars. Because he is a fixed supply, but he can be disseminated to people way beyond the arena, right, all over the world through TV or online streaming. Last thing here is prisoner's dilemma. So performance-enhancing drugs. Prisoner's dilemma has long been a kind of a philosophical tool that teachers have used when thinking about morality or decision-making, including economists. And this is looking at the incentive, right? So the decision here is, do you snitch or do you not snitch? That's why it's called the prisoner's dilemma. You can Google that and look up the prisoner situation. We're going to think about it from a baseball situation and performance-enhancing drugs, more of a sports example than a prison example. So sports is a zero-sum game, meaning either I win or I lose, right? And if I win, it means somebody else loses, right? I can't control other people's decision. So let's say that Mark doesn't use performance-enhancing drugs, and Sam also doesn't use performance-enhancing drugs. Then we're going to be in this territory right here, and there's no advantage for either person and there's no harm, right? If Mark continues not to use performance-enhancing drugs, but Sam does use performance-enhancing drugs, right, because this is a zero-sum game, right, Mark loses and Sam wins, right? So Mark feels like he's forced to use these performance-enhancing drugs so that he doesn't become the loser, right? Well, then we get down in this situation where, okay, they're both using performance-enhancing drugs. There's no advantage, just like there was no advantage when neither one was using them, but now there's harm done, right? I think from a pure standpoint, from a general health and morality standpoint, we would rather not see our athletes use performance-enhancing drugs, but this is how we arrive at this situation because of this situation, this dilemma, and why it continues to pop up in sports over and over. And it's an issue in the labor market, right? As we think about labor market economics. All right, so we're going to, in Chapter 9, talk about monopsony. Monopsony is when there's a single buyer. We've talked a lot about monopoly when there's a single seller, but now we're going to look at what about when there's a single buyer of labor. See that?